Yeah, that's the aim, to reinforce the connections and then to build a vision in the meantime, so that when the crisis slows down or disappears, although I don't believe in that, like we have a clear path to follow, what do we want, where do we want to go.
Hi, I'm Diana Filimon, and you're listening to FundAction Talks, a podcast about sharing stories of activists around Europe. First of all, we wanted to have this podcast as an opportunity to talk, but in general to promote what people in FundAction are doing this period, because it's very interesting even to see how we are surviving or how we are adapting to this period, what solutions do we find or what problems do we find, and to share them with the rest of us. So I would first like to tell me a few things about yourselves and about the NGO or the project which you are representing, and how come you ended here in FundAction. So, Vladimir, would you start?
So, hello everyone. My name is Vladimir Us. Myself, I'm an artist and curator based in Chisinau, in Moldova, active under the umbrella of Oberlith Association mainly. I'm also teaching. FundAction somehow came into my way due to different collaborations that we had with partners on European level, that many of them were intermediated also by European Cultural Foundation. So in a way, we ended up joining this platform and joining the effort to produce a change on wider European level.
How about you, Aleksandar?
I'm at the moment multi-hat person, and I will be now probably speaking about Solidarity Fund of Cultural Workers, which is just newly established entity, but I was part in establishing it. And that got this small but important grant from FundAction. But I'm very active in Magazine Culture Center. That was 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, funded by the big renovation process was funded. It was a very successful process, and it showed how FundAction is efficient in tricky situations, because we are a cultural center and space that doesn't have legal contract with the owner, which is the city, and we were very prosperous cultural center and very functional, but we were never able to fundraise other way because we don't have a contract for various reasons. And then that's when I came to the contact with FundAction, and it was at that moment very, very positive. And then I was lingering around till this situation that we needed to fundraise for this activity.
We try to put together people who work in similar areas or push things in similar areas. So the two of you are now working and have applied for the Resist Fund because you are trying to help people from the cultural department in various ways, like supporting them financially, basically, and helping them survive. And I think that culture was, especially in Eastern Europe, probably the most hit from who took the biggest hit, because we have a hard time understanding how important culture is and why the government should support this area more than it did before. And I think it was very problematic to adapt for artists all over and for cultural actors all over Eastern Europe especially. Tell us, how did the pandemic made itself felt in your projects? What were the first effects? Unemployment, lack of power of paying the bills, or the rent. When did you feel the first blow, let's say, from the pandemic? Who wants? It's free.
We had a very long debate in the beginning of this whole story, because we were very much self-reflective in a way to understand, are we really in a problem? Or, the problem is so global, and when the problem is so wide, are we the really ones that are anyhow important to be mentioned in the story about the people that, because artists and cultural workers are very heterogenic group. It's not like we're mine workers and mine closed down and then there's 10,000 of us, all the same, all equally unemployed and all equally, there are rich artists, not many, but they exist. Also very, very poor. And also those that are poor, they're sometimes all the time poor. They're, no matter what the situation of the economy, they're just too bohemian, too whatever, belong in some other world, and then they don't cope with any kind of economical system, and they're always poor. So then our first reasoning was totally opposite of what we end up doing. That let's do nothing and let's wait to see where this is going, and let's try not to stick out when everything else is falling apart. But then that was relatively short, and then we realized that we need to organize, that things are getting worse and worse, and that culture is needed at the moment very much, because a lot of cultural activities could be transferred to online platforms, and then this is something that people need in these times. And yes, that's where we started to work on this solidarity content. So yeah, in a way, I mean, of course, it's always important to mention that there are categories of people that are probably in much worse situation now, but it doesn't mean that we are fine. And also, artists and cultural workers, then when they are poor, they are really, really poor, and they are especially fucked up in this situation. So yes.
The Solidarity Fund you were mentioning is supporting our artists and cultural workers who are barely making it financially speaking during this period.
Yes.
So that's the cause. And you are gathering funds from several sources, right?
Yes. And we were especially provoked with the way how local governments deal with help to artists and cultural workers. First, they totally missed to understand the categories, and then they in the end ended up helping only some categories that, by some categorization, they recognize as artists, and everything else is not important. And they don't think that they are mean or evil. They just didn't bother to understand that categorization that is 50 or 70 years old, it's not applicable. And then a lot of people were left behind. And also, even those that were helped there was a lot of back and forth negotiation and promises because we were at the moment in the election campaign, and every politician used this situation to promise something, and then some other to say, no, I don't know what you're talking about, and then to promise again. And it was very, if it is designed to be help, it was very unfair to treat people like that.
Yeah, sounds familiar. It's a regional problem, at least. How is in Chisinau, Vladimir?
So pandemics affected differently my life and then the activity. So I could actually feel a big relief from this constant pressure that you have to do all the time something. Unexpected holiday, let's say, even if it's isolation and so on. Difficult conditions for most of us, but and of course, not everyone can afford a holiday, let's say, but in my case, I could, and it was important for me just to start thinking of my personal life and time and priorities beyond the activities which we are constantly involved with, and that take most of our time usually. And we are not left with even time for reflecting in the end of the day about what about yourself, like what.
How was your day?
Yeah. On the other hand, if we speak of the activities of Oberlith Association and other NGOs, most of them had to stop. Right, like in the middle of March, we already had to suspend all our activities. Due to two reasons. One, which was linked to restrictions imposed, and the other, there was no funding. In that time, we somehow didn't succeed to get any funding this year. Like for first half of the year, we were without any money, and it was creating new issues in terms of paying the rent and services and so on. So we had to search for additional funds abroad. That was one push. Like we have very small funds in Moldova, but somehow it didn't work this year for us. This pandemic, in fact, was also I could say was productive. Like on one hand, we had to stop the activities in terms of working with our audience, organizing events and so on. But on the other hand, pandemic made us think of like see it as an opportunity to develop advocacy dimension, so which doesn't require working with publics, but rather to think how to self-organize in a better way, in a way in which we can achieve some changes for independent cultural organizations and the artists and cultural workers. I mean, the idea of coalition of independent culture was in the air since probably 2012 or 13, when we kind of we would question the situation of funding, the lack of spaces for independent culture initiatives, and the lack of provisions. Basically, the state wouldn't perceive independent cultural organizations as a partner in its policies, strategies, and so on. So somehow the idea itself was floating in the air a long time ago, but it was only now somehow that this pandemic brought people together in an online rather mode, but somehow constructive way, and made us sort of advance with this coalition and the idea of establishing a platform which would advocate on behalf of independent cultural organizations, artists, and cultural workers. There was one more situation that somehow it coincided that we had the first risk of being evicted from one of our main spaces. It's a space we rent from Ethnography Museum, and we had some inspections by the Ministry of Culture, and because of the precarious conditions there, they would question if this space should work at all.
Like we say in Romanian, a trouble never comes alone or something.
Yeah, but it was not stupid, but paradoxical, because the Ministry of Culture itself is responsible for conditions in which museums are working, and from which we rent a space. But on the other hand, they also question this kind of situation. So it was strange. And this kind of signs we also received in previous years. This was one of the reasons why we also got interested in magazine in Belgrade, and we visited you guys last year. It was, I think, in April or May sometime. And it was also very helpful to see how a similar initiative is operating, both in terms of space, but also in terms of an umbrella NGO, which fights for better conditions for independent cultural scene. The pandemics, I should say, kind of put things together in one piece, and now we have a small but sort of ambitious, on this level, coalition, and we would like to make further steps to establish it by the end of this year.
FundAction is a participatory grant-making fund for social transformation organized within a community of over 250 activists based in Europe. We act together in a democratic and participatory way to support our social movements and initiatives working towards a just and equitable world. Through this series of podcasts, we will engage with our members and grantees about their experiences and practices towards systemic change. Enjoy their insights and be inspired. How do both of you see, the cultural sector in 6 or 8 months, let's say? What will change? Do you think it will suffer some big changes that will stay, or this is just temporary adapting to the situation, and hopefully in 1 year everything will return to normal?
We don't have normal. I mean, we never had in my life, so it's constant transition and some kind of chaos that is sometimes creative and useful and sometimes disasterful. I don't know, we're trying to, one entity that I'm also involved in and that started with other partners, this whole Solidarity Fund, this one of these umbrella organization Vladimir was mentioning, and we are kind of trying to steer this kind of independent scene, but also the term of being independent is quite bizarre, because then it implies that you're somehow totally independent and you're not. Just that you're not institutionalized, you're not established by government directly. But anyhow, yes, we are constantly working on it to try to understand this what you asked, but and constantly trying to establish some kind of structural grants. But it's so much chaos. Really feel this as special times. I mean, it's somehow normal that we usually have several years of some kind of fictional prosperity, and then we have several years of some kind of, let's say, downfall, and then it goes up and down, and I don't know, maybe we manage somehow time to reach some kind of stability, long-term planning, etc., or we will just learn to enjoy it. This is big challenge. Yes, this is big challenge. I mean, of course, because now it's people are dying and etc. Hospitals are full, whole system, healthcare systems collapsing. So it is a bit more than usual. But for example, also culture was here very active during 90s and way more active than later. Culture like to have some cause to act, some kind of tangible problem to address. It looks like, I don't know, for good or for bad, it looks like that these times are one way or another coming back here. Just this week, we had very big and violent protests. It was first violent protest after more than 10 years. I don't know, it's very debatable, is it good or bad, but, and also it was very, very mixed crowd from far left to far right. And it's not good, it's just the indicator how it's starting to be again very unstable, as if it was not already unstable by now. But yes, we will see. I have no idea, really. I can see any kind of post-apocalyptic scenario coming to light. One thing that I cannot imagine is that we go back to some kind of normal something, just because we never had it.
Yeah, normal is overrated.
Yes.
Vladimir, do you think, you were saying about this coalition, do you think at least we will remain with a bigger or a higher level of solidarity after this crisis? Or is it temporary? Or how do we keep some good things out of this?
Yeah, that's the aim, to reinforce the connections and then to build a vision in the meantime, so that when the crisis slows down or disappears, although I don't believe in that, like we have a clear path to follow, what do we want, where do we want to go. The other thing is that independent artists, like artists themselves, and some are affected very much. So I don't know whether we will end up with them in half a year or without them. That's more a question. Like if they don't have to change profile and go to get some jobs, basically, and forget about activity in the art field. And that's one of the challenges. And on the other hand, I also think that culture and arts will have to focus more on social issues, and that's also maybe a positive thing in terms of, like, you see probably less concerts now, like, this mass parades and so on, and that's maybe an indicator that culture could be useful somewhere else, not just entertaining. So the role of entertaining will be maybe less present in the future, and it means more energy could go somewhere else and to some social issue. Yeah, probably this pandemic affects mainly the industries in that sense, like those who run spaces and run this kind of events, basically. And so those will be affected mainly, and they will have to rethink what they do after in half a year, for example. While for us, it's really an opportunity to think how to redirect our energy in a constructive way to deal with more pertinent issues and to build more solidarity in the artistic circle itself, which lacks, in fact, solidarity and was lacking until now, also because of scarce of resources, because of lack of
basically a competition for funds.
This competition, but on the other hand, the logic, how do we function as cultural organizations and relate to each other. So this coalition is actually is more like a place to also to speak about what kind of values do we have in common, what sort of relations do we want to build with each other, what kind of organizational model we want to have. So all these basically basic questions which allow to put a structure and to start like a new, chapter, let's say, in our local cultural history.
Hopefully a good one, a good chapter. As a closing question, I would like to ask you about systemic change, which sounds so elaborated or intellectual, but now could be a moment to push systemic change in our fields. Do you think this could be the beginning of a systemic change or not, or is just business as regular? And towards what are you striving in this direction of systemic change with your NGOs, with your initiatives, with your coalitions, with whatever?
Systemic change, yes. No, I wasn't sleeping. I was thinking I was deep in thoughts how to tackle that question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's how to say? It sounds to me like the systemic change is a fancy new word for either doing nothing or being or to cover up any kind of revolutionary thinking and ideas that are too edgy to be openly
called revolutions.
To be openly negotiated, and then I don't see really some kind of system change in this, let's say, capitalistic reality. Will it? I mean, also, you of course cannot go to 1918 or whatever, the Russian Revolution. It's not. We're already 1 century after that. It's not the same situation. We cannot sell the same ideas, but that type of despair and feeling that we don't have any other option is somehow still present. And I think that idea of some kind of well-organized, well-regulated, happy capitalism with the human face, I don't see that people are buying that story anymore. Because when we were, for example, getting rid of Milosevic almost 20 years ago now in Serbia, the whole anti-Milosevic story came on that tide of believing in some kind of happy, very, very well regulated, open market society that is that thing that is making Europe happy society. But people are not believing that anymore, and I'm not sure how, even in the center of Europe, people are believing that. What is the alternative? I don't know. Is it something that is openly, totally anti-systematic, anti-capitalistic, or there is some middle way, or there is some science fiction, techno-utopia, whatever, that is not even mentioned or taught? Maybe. So
which was not
something needs to be done, and usually revolutions do appear and fire up when people are very unhappy, and especially when middle class loses this kind of trust. I mean, for the people that are poor and that are artists, I mean, artists always complain. That's kind of normal. But when middle class people stop believing in the society they live in, and when they start to feel that they are in some kind of economical instability, and when they start think that they have nothing to lose, is the moment when everything can happen. It's just that there is no written roadmap where to go after this point.
Definitely. Vladimir, what do you think?
Of course, each of us, we have some goals and aims on personal level or on the level of our organizations. And I'm trying to imagine what could we deal with in the future with the help of the coalition, which is just starting. So you caught us just in the moment when we discuss about forming. So to be clear that there is no coalition yet, it still has to appear to be. So to produce any systemic change, we need a kind of structure, functional structure. That's first aim, first objective, first of all. But then the question is what to engage, but probably those issues which got somehow forgotten during the 90s, during this economic political transition, which we all witness still happening until today, during which the field of culture remained somehow on the edge or on the margin. It was never paid attention to, and it kind of by inertia tried to develop itself somehow, but basically it didn't develop that much. And we lost a lot of time until now during these changes. And the field of culture itself still needs to be rethought. And there are many questions like how do we support new independent cultural initiatives? How do we create space for them? How do we maybe one important is like this social security for independent artists, for example, which doesn't exist. And this kind of questions basically that got completely forgotten or lost in the process, and no one really asked today about them, not even the Minister of Culture. So we tried through the platform, we will try to address some of these issues and try to make them at least visible and put them on the agenda. And then we see if they are the decision makers will adopt them, then maybe this will be a step towards this kind of systemic, bigger change. And more equilibrated, let's say, society in terms of having more, like also cultural workers included, not just always excluded from different the support schemes which exist in the state.
Definitely, that's sounds like a plan for for Moldova at least. Gentlemen, thank you so much for spending half an hour and talking to me. I know it's hard to answer some questions now because things are very unclear, but at least we try, and hopefully we'll inspire people to ask more questions and to think together about the answers. So in the name of everyone from FundAction, thank you. Good luck with your projects, and let's hope we see them grow as much as you want them to.
Thank you. I hope this format will catch up, and because it is one way to stay in touch with the network.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Have an awesome day.